So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for our second conversation with Muhammad Ali Center. And I am so pleased to announce our panel for this evening for our conversation, Healthy at Home, Healthy at Work, Viewing the COVID-19 Crisis Through a Racial Justice Lens. Again, my name is Daryl Young Jr., manager
Muhammad Ali Center.
And we're just happy to have this esteemed panel with us. I'm going to introduce our panelists and our moderator, and then I'm going to get out of the way and let them begin. We have with us this evening Dr. Brandy Kelly Pryor with the Humana Foundation, T. Gonzalez, Director of the Center for Health Equity, Trinidad Jackson, Senior Research Fellow for the University of Louisville School of Public Health, Dr. Daryl Williams, Doctor of Physical Therapy, Clinic Director for Pro Rehab Physical Therapy Highland Branch, and our moderator for this evening is Dr. Stephen Nifley, who is Associate Director for the Spalding University Center for Behavioral Health.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Mr. Young, for the opportunity to be a part of this panel and to be amongst such esteemed folks. So if you all don't mind, we'll just kind of jump right into it with a couple of our questions. So, you know, right now we're in the midst of this pandemic, and there's been a lot of research that has suggested that Black and brown folks are being differentially impacted by the pandemic, and that's led to significant racial disparities. Can you all talk with me a little bit about in what ways have you seen Black and Brown folks being differentially impacted by the current pandemic?
I can start off on that. Through the research and what we've seen, that there's actually, there's an increase as far as mortality rate in Black and Brown people compared to others, as a result of COVID. And, some of the underlying things I think that we see as a result of this or what are causing this is a lot of underlying comorbidities that patients actually already have prior to getting COVID, and then their inability to fight off the illness and the body to recover from that. As far as that community, a lot of them work in public facing occupations where they don't have the luxury of working from home. They're out actually serving the public, increasing their risk for exposure to the disease. You got to look at living situations. Urban living, tends to be a really crowded, a more dense population in those areas where the disease can spread faster. It's harder to maintain social distancing, when you have more people around or more people in one household. So you see a higher instance of them not only getting the illness, but actually having a higher mortality rate as a result of that.
Thank you for sharing. I hear challenges related to comorbidity. I hear public-facing occupations and that increasing risk, and then also housing as potential factors as well. Thank you for sharing. What about other folks? How other ways have you seen folks differentially impacted?
Yeah, I think that's a really, in terms of what we're seeing most readily, the mortality rates and the actual getting of COVID are definitely one ways to think about the disproportionate impact, and that goes along with the lines of race, class. One of the things that I think is really important for us to think about too in terms of the jobs is gender and how domestic labor as well as gig economies, how all of that, not only the impact of the disease on the body, but the impact of COVID-19 that it's had on our economy, and what is the disproportionate impact that that is having on communities of color. And so when we think about campaigns like wash your hands and how important that is to wash your hands and social distance, we can't have that conversation without thinking about the disproportionality of communities of color who, particularly in the rural South, Black communities, or when we're thinking about the Navajo Nation even. I was just thinking about Flint, Michigan yesterday, and always being in constant remembrance that what we're seeing of COVID-19 is not as a result of COVID-19 and the disproportionality in terms of the impact that it's having on Black and Brown communities, but it's the disproportionate impact that our system of inequities has had on chronic disease rates, on the ability to social distance because of housing, on the ability to have clean drinking water or water to safely sanitize in situations. When we think about who is at risk for the racial bias that we might see in our healthcare system, or even access to healthcare in our communities, all of that is compounded by what we're seeing with the actual rate of the disease. But in terms of the impact of it and the recovery of it, I think that is going to largely be really impacting both Black and Brown communities because of our system of systemic racism in this country.
Mm. So
systemic racism, Dr. Kelly Pryor. I want to chime in as well and say that COVID is simply a new name for a familiar context when we talk about Black and Brown people, and that context is marginalization. And so before going any further, I definitely want to say her name, Breonna Taylor, as we are in the midst of, battling with what we're discussing right now, COVID. The context of her death definitely contextualizes some of the things that Dr. Kelly Pryor just hit on. So I want to take a second or a couple of seconds, more than a couple of seconds, to read the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense 10-point program. And that is essentially, a declaration of physical needs for Black communities as well as philosophical principles. And that was, declared in 1967. 1, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. 2, we want full employment for our people. 3, we want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our Black and oppressed communities. 4, we want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. 5, we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. 6, we want all Black men to be exempt from military service. 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. 8, we want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. 9, we want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from their Black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. And 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And so with the exception of the explicit identification of Black men, which needs to read Black persons, this 10-point platform is spot on. It's dead on with everything that we are battling and everything that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been producing a number of quantitative reports for years that project the types of lives and the types of communities that we must navigate as Black and brown people. And we've had our stories, we've had our demands, our voices projected for millennia, right? And in 2020, we're still having this type of conversation of exploring, again, the familiarity of the context that is labeled with an infectious disease. And so it's critically important that we understand the historical context of how long we've been fighting against such impediments, whether they're chronic or infectious in nature, and also understand, and identify, understand, and react to the fact that they are rooted in white supremacy and racism.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It certainly adds a contextual piece for us to think about a familiar face, a new face to the same problem that's been going on. What other thoughts do folks have about the ways in which Black and brown people have been differentially impacted? I know one of the things that we can kind of also get into as we start talking a little bit about those historical actions. So the comorbidity, the housing, the limited job opportunities that increase vulnerability to different, to the pandemic and all those things are all connected to those systems that Dr. Kelly Pryor was talking about earlier. So like, what are some of those systems, right? So we've mentioned like housing, we've mentioned kind of like job opportunities, economic development opportunities. Like, what's the connection for just a layperson between what we're seeing now and those systems that have impacted folks to create that greater vulnerability?
Yeah, I think one of the pieces that has been mentioned here, and Trinidad mentioning, jails and prisons in the platform is, I think that is another, as we've looked at the spread of this virus, one of the things that we look at is congregate settings, and certainly jails and prisons constitute, these congregate settings, and there's multitudes of historic and present day action that drive Black and brown people into jails and prisons. And, you know, really for often for very minor kind of infractions as they're, you know, as they were. We know of that in not just in our community, but in communities across the country, people being held in jail for owing very little in court and other fees and other debts, monetary debts, and whether or not this is, you know, the appropriate place for people to be held for having those debts with all the vulnerabilities that it exposes people to. You know, I've seen some very, like, truly tragic stories of people who have been in jail or prison systems during this time, who, you know, had relatively small amounts, not to them, obviously, but small amounts of dollars that are owed, right, that they're have, you know, bail for or something like that, and get sick, have become very sick, and in some instances die. And for people who have maybe like a sentence of a year or so. So in that time of them being in jail or prison for a year, as their sentence were, they've experienced this virus, been sick in there, and in some instances died. And this is the reality that we all have to live with, is that we are funneling people into a system that many would argue does not make sense for dealing with some of the issues that we have in our community. And in this case, it contributes then to the spread of disease, and certainly increased risk for people, and because of how our system is set up, increased vulnerability for Black and brown people across this country in our jail and prison systems.
It's almost like a double punishment, and a lot of it has to do with your inability to pay to get out of the prison setting. And that's essentially what your crime is in that space, is not being able to afford to leave, and then are punished because of that.
And in this instance, even within, in the context of a global pandemic, to be held sometimes for $500, and that increased exposure and potentially life-threatening. I think the other thing that should be said that is maybe not talked about as much is that we talk a lot about the deaths that can happen, and those numbers are reported when it relates to COVID. But it's a serious virus that even if you don't die, you may be left with, and many people, we don't know the full impact yet of what the long-term effects it can have on the body, even though you may not die. So people may be left with chronic conditions and disability for a very long time. And that is a very high price to pay for, you know, maybe owing $500 to a court system. That is, has to be seen as completely unfair and unjust and just unreasonable for us as a community and across our country.
So, and while we're on the theme, try to be quick to stick to some of the commentary you made, T. Going back to mass incarceration, again, I think it's important for us to identify just some of the ways that we've, you know, arrived to the place where we are over-policing Black and brown communities. And so just one of the catalysts was the power of a white researcher that engaged in a quantitative predictive model that said Black crime, Black murder will be on the rise. There will be blood spillage in the streets, right? This is the language that these gentlemen perpetuated and projected to our communities, to our policymakers, and thereby facilitated a certain paradigm that enacted policy to police us and policy to lock us up. And then additionally, you mentioned, you know, some of the fees that are owed within this criminal injustice system. Many of the people who are held additionally, they don't owe fees. They're there simply because they've been identified, but they haven't been they haven't been charged or sentenced, right? And so they're going to afford to bail out. Bail isn't what they owe. Bail is what the system says, we want you to pay us to receive your liberty back from an unjust paradigm or perspective, right? And so then, T, as you mentioned, people who not only die within this system, but also contract the virus and now have to live with the repercussions of it. Who's responsible for that, right? Who's paying for their quality of life thereafter when they've gone through this trajectory of injustice?
I just think this is so fascinating. Being on this call with some of my colleagues who I'm on the call with, I'm just like, you're always making me think. And even now, even more, I'm like, oh. So thank you for letting me think about this. But I mean, we really have to take the criminal justice system, not only in context of the economics that I think T is so aptly bringing up, but how economics and history and racism in this country have been so intertwined to say, how do we create even more a system of imprisonment, but a system that will keep a control as well as injustice over people's physical bodies that now has an impact not only on their health because of COVID. And we can talk about all the reasons in terms of why the prison system is a horrible place to be as it relates to COVID, but thinking about how the chronic diseases that we have as communities of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color through the prison system, the weathering that effect has had on bodies over generations. I mean, just thinking about processes such as the social isolation from imprisonment that happens, the ability to eat well, while in prison, and in some ways in a system in which you are creating the economy, both the agricultural economy as well as other producing that you're doing within that system, and how at the same time you're not getting the nutrition that is needed while you're in prison. And we're thinking, think about it, for like 20-year sentences and longer in terms of the impact that this is having on someone's body, the impact that this is having on their future generations as a result of being in prison. When we talk about infant mortality rates, I think it is very it's probably a no-brainer to think that infant mortality rates are impacted by the person who is in gestation. If they are giving birth, then their child either might be born too early to live life or might be born under birth weight. But what we don't also consider is that those low birth weight, which has an impact on your heart disease in the future, which has an impact on your asthma and your diabetes, which has an impact on how you are able to fight off something like COVID-19, that is impacted by the partner of the parent that might be having the child. So it's not just the person that is imprisoned that is impacted now, but it is their entire family, not only from the psychological and the mental aspect of it, the economic aspect of it, but also now we're seeing even in the gestational period of a person who is impacted by the process of incarceration.
So there's the potential experience of this like generational transmission of various forms of trauma, economic trauma, physical trauma, relational trauma, et cetera, that are just kind of like passed down, that are impacted also then by this experience of being incarcerated, which is also its own form of trauma that is influenced by all these things that we've been kind of discussing in this space. There's a story I want to tell about that, but I realized I'm just here to ask questions, so I'm gonna stick to that. I'm gonna stick to asking the questions. So as you think about that experience of generational trauma, talk with me a little bit about what are some of the long-term consequences that you might expect to happen because of what we're seeing now, or that are a contribution to other things that have already kind of followed this line of what we're seeing now. So what are some long-term consequences that you're expecting to occur?
I mean, I think beyond the physical health impact, which that's going to be studied for and is being studied now. But again, short of death, I think it's very unclear still exactly, what the long-term impact on the body will be. I think, read reports of people who are not having, kind of a short bout with COVID. Some people are having, I think they maybe call it long COVID or something like that, is they are experiencing pretty harsh symptoms for months at this point. So I think we don't know exactly, I think what the long-term impact on the body may be. Otherwise, in terms of the long-term consequences of this, like, quite frankly, it's an overwhelming question. And I try to think about some other, at least trying to think within the U.S. context, some other very large events that have happened. So if you think about, like, the impact after, like, Hurricane Katrina or after the housing crisis, right? That we know from that period that Black and brown people in that instance were not impacted the same, right? In terms of the impact during the housing crisis, what the impact on people's wealth levels, while everyone, was impacted negatively, Black and brown people had disproportionate negative impacts. I'm concerned about how long and what the opportunities will be, certainly economically, for people to recover. So many people across the country have lost their job, just astronomical unemployment at this time, and what that means for possibilities for people to recover from that impact. I know that lots of people are experiencing kind of devastating financial realities at this point, with no real hope for when's the end of this pandemic. And I know that many people feel that every day. I think we have to think about children at this time, in terms of just their social life and development. I think is, a real appreciation for all the parents who are doing some seriously heavy lifting in engaging their children 24 hours a day, but also, the lack of socialization or in-class time. Fortunately for some of our children who don't have access, then, because people are at home all the time and not in the classroom building, not all of our children are living in homes that are safe for them. And so this means, like, a lack of opportunity to connect with other caring and supportive adults who may be that watchful eye to make sure that things are less bad, or who can be able to speak up for a child who, something's not right at home, but they don't have that right now. So that's a lifelong, adverse childhood experience that we know has an impact on health. And so again, this kind of what's the long-term impact of all of this, it really can overwhelm you to think about the endless amount of impact it will have.
I think to continue on, with the, in the realm of the financial and economical impact, you can think about the person that, contracts the disease and has the long-term consequences of contracting, COVID-19, their inability, maybe they're the main provider for their family and their inability to return back to work or, to be able to provide that income to their family. And then you talk about children, I don't know how many parents we have on here, but ultimately you want to leave your kids in a better spot than where you were in life. And if you've suffered a really hard financial impact as a result of contracting the disease or as a result of the pandemic in general, that can really, trickle down to your children and the inability to provide them with opportunities that will, put them in a better position, as they grow and become contributing members of society.
I'm sorry, please go on. You got it.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that there are two ways, it's two sides of a coin here. The long-term impact that we're going to see, some of which is really positive, right? Like I think a long-term impact is going to be that we can see how we could have done things differently for so long and how we can change quickly when we need to. We can see what it means to get people who need it most stimulus checks quickly in the mail. We can see what a system of voting could look like if we voted from home or if we had longer periods of time to vote. The process of doing education differently because everybody doesn't learn in the same way, and how this period of time might have impacted children with different learning styles to do it in the way that they needed to do it. We could see how that is going to have a positive impacts, and the healthcare system or others showing up in different ways for people that need it and should not, be evicted from their homes because of one health crisis. I think some of the things that we are not talking a lot about and that we will need to, and I'm so glad that both Dr. Williams and T brought them up, but the impact on children and the impact not only for what it means for the wealth gap. I think a lot about intersectionality, and so what it means to be a woman during this crisis, a woman of color, and how more so than even the financial crisis that we experienced a few years ago, this particular pandemic is hurting women of color the most because of the labor market that they are in and the amount of time in which they are going to be out of the labor force. And we know with policies like FMLA and other leave acts that we have, that protection of time out of the workforce is so critical to really seeing 20 and 30 years into the future. I think a lot of economists have talked about this period of time not being the recovery that women have made in the last 30 to 40 years in terms of labor in this country. We're back to some of those pre-1970 rates based off of the time in which women have had to spend out of the workforce. And when we think about the amount of Black and brown women that are large wage earners for their homes, whether it be dual earners or not, that is going to have an impact on the wealth gap even further for children. And I think more so in thinking about that physical connection and touch, I am not a person that has been alone in my house for the past however long. I am not alone. And it's been a beautiful thing, I think, in some ways to, be connected, but thinking about how many people are physically alone and have not had human touch in, thinking 4 to 6 months, not physically hugging someone, like what kind of impact is that going to have when we do re-engage as a society? What impact is that going to have on children when they're having to engage with people that are not someone that they live with, or, so I think we're all going to really have a mental shift of being in large crowds again, that we don't even know. We don't even know the long-term impacts of this from our social sense of belonging and connectedness. But in a very healthy and happy, optimistic way, I'm excited that we are having deeper conversations that we can't turn back from. You know, when I entered into my role 5 years ago, talking about health equity, it was like, oh, you know, you're always starting from scratch. Now it's like everybody, right, is talking about like, what is the root cause of a health issue, or what is a social determinant, or what is health equity, and how are people disproportionately impacted? That's a win in terms of us changing our language as a society and really having honest conversations about systemic racism.
So talk with me a little bit, and this is coming from more that kind of psychological lens, because that's kind of a little bit of my wheelhouse, is we're in the midst of this collective trauma, right? And there's been a collective trauma that has preceded this for various Black and brown folks in all the ways that we've been talking about. What are your thoughts about how this collective trauma will impact the social emotional well-being of our youth, and then other folks kind of moving forward? What thoughts do you have about those things?
Oh, and it's not even long term. This has been happening in the midst, but the current context and landscape that we have to navigate, especially from a young person perspective, is impacting their ability to dream, their ability to hope, their ability to act as change agents. Prior to the Breonna Taylor uprising, I was engaged with so many young people who were essentially, using some of their language, detonated, right? They felt like, what am I doing, right? I can't see anyone. I can't engage in school regularly. I'm already a student with academic challenges. I can't engage in a classroom, or I can't engage in office hours with professors. From a work perspective, am I of use to this world? What is my purpose, right? So many things from a psychological perspective were being challenged for many of the young people with whom I work. And then when you compound that with all of the racial injustice that is further contextualized marginalization, it's done nothing but exponentiate their feelings, right? So they attempt to engage in a lot of the activism that's going on. But because of that collective trauma, that term that you mentioned, Dr. Nifley, the collective trauma, that again isn't rooted in COVID, is rooted in our collective experience as Black and brown people. All of those symptoms have been manifesting, right? Trauma responses as us as adults engage in activism, community leadership, community building, social capital. And so as we're attempting to engage from a positive construction perspective, all of that trauma just keeps pulling us back. And so young people are seeing and mimicking some of those trauma response behaviors in addition to experiencing their own. And so now what I'm having to address and engage with is young people who are essentially at the point of bowing out, saying, right, I have no hope. I don't see where we're going from here. It's the same thing that you all have been fighting for hundreds of years, and nothing is ever going to change. And so, hitting back on the last question for a second, it asked the concerns of long-term consequences. One of the concerns that I have is just that, right? How we can't afford for any of us to lack the hope, to lack the optimism that's needed for us to engage in pedagogy and practice of liberation. And so with that being stated, Dr. Kelly Pryor mentioned some of the positive things. And so there have been many positive things from a community building and social capital aspect that have emerged from our community that have been in response to both COVID-19 and Breonna Taylor's uprising. A number of Black-led and Black women-led initiatives and organizations that are popping up to address the collective trauma, to address some of the immediate daily needs that we have as a community. And so from a concern perspective, the concern is that there is an opportunity for us to not engage in that critical reflexivity that's necessary for us to say, this is what we have done well. How do we capture that and how do we build upon that, right? How do we hold that as sacred for our communities and ensure that that we are cascading how we got there, right? How are we, from the collective trauma perspective, how are we facilitating collective inclusion of building the positive landscape that is keeping us and our spirit sustained as we move forward? So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that aspect of it.
Can I add one thing to that collective? I think it's important in talking about from the collective trauma to the collective building that we also talk about the collective rest that's needed, and for there to be that rest from those who are, you know, I think we can look at everyone, all of the petitions and uprisings around George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, you know, all of this that has happened in our country from the different identity points in which we see the dismissing of Black lives. I think what we are also seeing is that there is a choice that people are making, largely around how do I socially engage and collectively build for a new future that is possible in the face of the pandemic, and knowing that I am making a choice between being in social spaces that in some ways could create fear around the lack of social distance, but I feel that hope of I can change something. I think that's really powerful. And how do we also create a space for people who are on the front lines? I think Trinidad just talked about, you know, the Black women-led movement that especially that we're seeing here in Louisville around Breonna Taylor. How do we also create a space where it's like someone does not need to go all the time, but we create space where others get to, you know, it's a marathon, you know, you get to tap out and someone else gets to tap in. When we think about Ruby Bridges, I think she recently had a birthday, and her Ruby Bridges as the first person to integrate a school in the South. It's so amazing to me because she's the same age as my mother, and my mother and I often get confused for sisters, you know? So I think that that is just a reminder to me that this fight, in terms of really when we're thinking about the Civil Rights Act, when we're thinking about Brown versus Board of Education, it has not been a long time in terms of lifetime of people. My mother is the same age as the first person to integrate a school in the South. And so when we're thinking about how lives of Black people have been dismissed and how we want to bring young people to the space of collective building and knowing that we can do a lot in a day. And that's what the pandemic has taught us, that we can overturn systems and we can get resources to where they need to go. But at the same time, we have a lot of unearthing to do, a lot of reckoning that needs to be done about this power system in our society that has really decentered Black lives from the start of this country.
Well, these are really great points. Talk with me a little bit about what actions and policies. So Mr. Jackson had mentioned this idea that currently there's significant collective building going on. And Dr. Kelly Pryor had mentioned being able to see the positive side of the coin, where there have been perhaps innovations in how we do things based on the pandemic. What actions or policies or things have you all seen that have came out of this current pandemic that have really been beneficial for Black and Brown folks?
You know, I think we've seen some actions on behalf of some businesses or corporations, others. You know, whether it's gone far enough, there's plenty of debate for that. But we've seen where, you know, folks in jobs who are not making a ton of money, you know, grocery store workers, other warehouse workers, things like this, who, you know, businesses were able to find $2 more an hour or more to keep people in these positions, right? So in the middle of a pandemic, we're just able to find those dollars, and it, you know, certainly, you know, one has to ask, well, why aren't those workers, you know, worthy of increased pay all the time for the very hard work that they're doing? And it's so clear at this point, that these are people who are absolutely keeping our communities and our society running. And we all ought to be recognizing that. So I think that's one thing, you know, and looking at, it should, you know, hopefully we don't want those things, those increases to be temporary. Folks should have good, decent wages all the time. I think some of the other thing too, some of these same companies, you know, were able to find ways to have paid sick leave for workers who previously were not eligible for such a benefit. You know, I think paid sick leave, and we've also saw on the other side that there were places that did not offer paid sick leave in the middle of the most, the largest, you know, public health event of our time, still were not able to find paid sick leave for their employees. You know, I think we have to see this as, so long as people are working, they ought to be able to have time, if they are sick, to be off and to not worry about whether or not their job is going to be there and whether or not they're able to feed their family, to keep a roof over the head, because you know, if it's not COVID, then they have the flu or something like that. And that is the reality that many workers live in every single day across this country. And so, you know, paid sick leave is good for workers, and it's good for the rest of us as a community when people who are sick can stay home and do so competently, make the right choice for their own bodies, but for the rest of our bodies as well. To be able to stay home and not have to worry about, you know, life cost is really critical. And I think if we don't understand that as a community and really as a country at this point, given the past 6 months, I'm not really sure, you know, how else we can get the point across here. But I think that that's a critical step that some folks have made, businesses have made in some situations, but I hope that, like Dr. Kelly Pryor was talking about, some of the possibilities for the future, that will be one that businesses and of all kinds can recognize the benefit for workers, but also the social good that it provides to have paid sick leave for everyone.
You know, I think, to kind of elaborate a little bit on that, I think one of the good things that came out of this is, and I don't, you know, it's good for the recipient of it, but I think it brought a lot of transparency to a lot of companies, because with the current pandemic going on and the social uprising, people were closely watching what companies were doing what and how they were treating their employees and what types of messages these companies were putting out to decide if they were going to continue to support them. So I think in light of all of this, a more watchful eye has been brought on to these companies and has forced them to do, I guess, the so-called right thing, which should have been done in the first place, to make sure that it was fair for everyone. You know, so I think that's one positive thing that came about this, is that everybody really had to show their true face during this. And some people did a good job of it and some people didn't. And the ones that did obviously gained a lot of support, and their businesses have excelled as a result of it. And those that didn't lost a lot of support and, you know, went the other way with it. So You know, and that's ultimately to the benefit of the employee.
So actions and policies. What I want to do, especially since we have an audience that could benefit, I want to definitely shout out Change Today, Change Tomorrow, being led by Taylor Ryan. So earlier this year, her and her team were setting up tables in specific areas throughout the city to give away food, clothing, and personal items to homeless people. And so that's blown up. Now they're receiving, you know, monetary donations as well as item donations from organizations, from individuals, et cetera. And they also facilitate the Feed the West program. So definitely look up Change Today, Change Tomorrow. So when we talk about that collective community building, that's an example of that. Additionally, Black Market, that's a grocery store that is being started by Chantrice Martin, another Black woman, essentially to aid in filling the gaps, the accessibility gaps that we have in West Louisville as it relates to healthy and accessible food. Additionally, when we talk about being healthy at home, well, if so many people are being evicted or have to go through, you know, the turbulence of navigating eviction court, well, here are, you know, some eviction resources that people can look up and engage with. So the first is Healthy at Home Eviction Relief Fund. Next is Team Kentucky Fund. Next, we have Jefferson County COVID-19 Eviction Prevention Fund. Next, Jefferson County Eviction Diversion Project. And then last on my list, there, you know, it's possible that there are many more, but last is Volunteers of America. So they're assisting people with that as well. And then going back to what we've talked about a lot on this call as well as some of the roots of our issues. Over the past year and some change, racism has been declared as a public health crisis or emergency in 65 jurisdictions across 17 states in the United States. And so after doing some research, I found that this was never an agenda item for our Louisville Metro Council. And so July 15th, I was able to engage the Community Affairs, Health and Education Committee, and they entitled it a special presentation, but for me, it was just the outset of the conversation leading to action of declaring racism as a public health crisis in the city. And so a couple of people, Dr. Stephen Ifley is a part of that effort. T. Gonzalez has been on a couple of calls, but essentially what that looks like currently is the mayor preparing to engage in an executive order. Also, Metro Council preparing for a resolution that addresses racism as a public health crisis. But lastly, how do we, when we talk about policy that facilitates resource allocation, how do we build an ordinance that supports and facilitates resource allocation and further addresses some of the issues that are rooted in systemic racism? So those are some of the actions and some of the policies that have been taken over the several months that I'm aware of.
And I guess I'll just piggyback on that idea around resource allocation. I think some of the changes that have happened at the macro level in terms of philanthropy has asked new questions in terms of why does philanthropy exist? And these are questions that I think Pockets of Philanthropy has asked for a while now. But in terms of really thinking about, is philanthropy existing to really do the work that communities need, or to have ticks on the box around reporting structures and how that happens in communities? So I think what's been really an outcome that we've seen I won't give it value, good or bad, but an outcome that we've seen in communities that is going to have an impact on communities is the fact that philanthropy has said, especially during COVID, and many signed the Council on Foundations pledge to say, we're going to allow resources in community to go where communities want their resources to go. It's not fitting into a small box that a philanthropic organization says fund this, but fund what you need in community. So when you think about an organization like Change Today, Change Tomorrow, or the Black Panthers Party, for example, you know, those aid organizations that say, we set up, we go, we do what we need to do for communities that need it. Philanthropy is now open to that in a new way. And also being very cognizant of the fact that people with lived experience, people who are from community, people who are culturally embedded in community, need to be organizations that are the ones that are invested in. Because I think when the pandemic was at its height and many people closed their doors, they closed their doors and they left communities. There were some organizations that were already of the community, in the community, that were still able to operate for the community partners that needed them the most. So that's, I think, from a resource allocation and a funding standpoint, that's something positive that has shifted and changed. And I think on a very personal level, the new conversations that I'm hearing among Black and Brown community members of just, who have you talked to? Have you talked to someone about this? Are you engaging? You know, thinking about mental health in a very different way, whether it is a person that is 20 years old and dealing with all of the trauma right around them in the community in terms of engaging in social activism, to if it is an 80-year-old who is isolated and alone in their home and have not been able to get out for anything. You know, I think there's been a deeper conversation about telehealth and counseling and mental health therapy in a way that is really broadened a conversation that I don't recall having 2 years ago.
So we thank you. With the time that we have, we do have a question in the chat that I want to make sure that we highlight. It says, can you comment on ongoing institutional and structural racism in healthcare delivery in the COVID and context of marginalized communities? So what thoughts do you have about healthcare delivery related to COVID, and how it's been impacted by institutional and structural racism?
I can elaborate. You know, when you look at healthcare coverage and insurances, you know, you see that, especially in those communities that just basic policies that assure basic needs, the community this community gets left out in that. You know, for example, coverage of like preventative types of physician visits and preventative types of, you know, other things that help to just establish a healthy lifestyle, you know, aren't often covered by insurances. Therefore, you know, that person's required to pay those things out of pocket. You know, and in the light of a pandemic, if they're financially, you know, in hardship, those aren't even options that person might be considering, you know, to purchase or implement, because their money has to go to something else. You know, there's no policies in place that, you know, embrace nutrition or opportunities for minorities to, you know, educate themselves about nutrition and health and wellness and other preventative things that will help to fight off these more chronic diseases. You know, if you look at school age, you know, if you go all the way down to children where, you know, they're easily influenced, you know, physical education and being pulled out of schools and not being really as much of a focus, you know, can lead to bad habits, you know, as they get older, and just help contribute to, you know, poor health conditions and increased comorbidities in these communities. You know, so I think it goes all the way back to just being able to, you know, have healthcare coverage for basic needs and preventative needs and educational opportunities in that community will help to change that landscape, you know, in the rise of, you know, possibly another pandemic. Hopefully not, but, you know, this, I think the more weapons you have from learning about your health and wellness and ways to prevent these types of things, the better you can fight off, you know, something like a pandemic.
Good. All right. Well, I'm just looking at our time here, so I want to throw it back to Mr. Young, and just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be in your presence and to share this space with you as we've had such a meaningful conversation. So I'll throw it back to Daryl.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nifley. Thank you to our panel. If we were in front of a live audience, I would tell you to give them a round of applause because they definitely deserve it. And we are extremely thankful for them lending us their expertise for this evening, for this conversation. To our audience, I want to say I hope you enjoyed the conversation, but more so just enjoyed the words and enjoyed the back and forth. What I hope folks are leaving with from these conversations is an incentive to act, an incentive to do, to feel compelled to really take what you've heard and take what you've learned from this conversation and actually put it into praxis. It's our hope through this series, I Am America, a play on the quote of Muhammad himself, who said, "I am the America that you won't recognize. I'm Black, I'm confident, I'm cocky, get used to me." This series is meant to be bold, it's meant to be courageous, it's meant to be challenging. It's meant to make you uncomfortable. If uncomfortable is what you need to advocate for the things that you've heard on this panel, what you heard from our panel 2 weeks ago, and what you will continue to hear as we go forth and really talk about some of the disparities, the issues that we face in our community. So we are glad that you are here with us, but we hope that you will be with us in action as well as in listening as well. So again, thank you to our panel. We are doing these weekly. Our next conversation will be September the 23rd. For that conversation, we'll be believing in a better world, talking with children about race and racial violence with the author Michael W. Waters. We'll come up with a new children's book for beautiful Black boys who believe in a better world. The illustrator, Ms. Keisha Morris, as well as myself, and Aaron Herbert, who got to contribute to the teacher's guide for that book. We also at the Muhammad Ali Center have a brand new exhibit called Truth Be Told, which is an examination of the history of systemic and institutional racism in America. And it is a real thought-provoking, provocative piece that we hope that you will come through the center and visit and see, and also contend with as well, because there's a lot of historical context to some of the issues that we see now. So we hope that you will be with us as the Muhammad Ali Center does our part in being a steward of our name, our brand, Muhammad, who was, before he was a boxer, before he was the greatest in the ring, he was an advocate for truth and justice. So we hope that these conversations are doing him proud. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you all again. Thank you.